Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Nicole Rodriguez Leach. I'm with the Aprendes Foundation. I'm a member of GFE's board of directors, and I served as the chair of the conference committee this year. I'd love to take a quick moment to acknowledge the committee members, an incredible group, and say thank you to each of them and the GFE staff for their energy, attention, and expertise, and drawing us all together here. Earlier this week, we heard the initial findings of GFE's survey on critical directions for the future of education philanthropy. Among respondents, racial justice tops the list of priorities, meaning that the future of racial justice in education is seen as the most important thematic area for education funders to focus on over the next 1 to 3 years, an area of high urgency, high opportunity for systemic change, and high potential for philanthropy to accelerate that change. However, survey results also indicate a variety of perspectives, as they often do. While resource inequities in school budgeting garnered broad agreement as an area where philanthropy can and should mobilize without delay, responses also indicated a lower sense of urgency around addressing issues such as punitive school discipline. Responses expressed concern also about philanthropy's potential to do harm if it engaged in efforts such as school desegregation, for example. So with this shared belief that philanthropy should actively advance racial justice, we hold a range of ideas on what matters and what to do. So today's plenary session will take this up, what matters and what to do. First, indulge me, I'd like to advance a couple of things. First, I advance that in order to engage in the type of transformation that racial justice requires, philanthropic organizations and actors, that means us, must consider the ways in which our sector has contributed to inequality and injustice in our society, past and present, even as we work to address those same inequalities and injustices. We must engage with the contradictions here. I do put forward that we should interrogate philanthropy's involvement in the very structures and systems that hold power. We must challenge our assumptions and pay very careful attention both to our giving practices and to how we construct relationships with education leaders in our capitals and in our communities alike. So this afternoon, we'll have a rich conversation about racial equity and racial justice. We'll talk about racism in the US social, economic, and political systems and in our democracy, and what it means for learners as well as the leaders who support and serve them in their homes, neighborhoods, schools, and beyond. We'll hear examples of philanthropic approaches and practices that engage in and support transformation toward racial justice. And we'll talk about where GFE as a community may go from here. So let's dig in. I am very, very happy to introduce our first and keynote speaker, Dr. Darrick Hamilton, who's going to provide us a very thoughtful and important context for our conversation today. Hopefully, not just for this dialogue and engagement, but the ones that we'll continue to have beyond the next 90 minutes. Darrick, give me a moment to say a few words about you. Dr. Darrick Hamilton is a pioneering and world-renowned scholar in the field of stratification economics, who examines the causes and consequences of inequality in economic, education, and health outcomes. His work is important not just to our understanding of racial inequality and injustice broadly, and to our understanding that this goes beyond just generating knowledge. He does not hang his hat just in that area. He also advances remedies to inequality, takes aim at the very structures and systems which now concentrate power in our social hierarchy, and is actively situated in movement toward racial justice. He's been described as a leading scholar on racial inequities, as an intellectual giant, as a policy guru, and as a scholar preacher. I would also describe Dr. Hamilton as very generous with his time, his guidance, his mentorship, advising presidential candidates, policymakers, and PhD students alike. Dr. Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and University Professor at the New School, whereas he's also the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy. So without further delay, welcome, Darrick. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm actually going to turn the mirror on you for a second to at least acknowledge that, in my view, you exemplify exactly what we need. I know this conversation is about informing philanthropy as well, and you exude that in my few years of knowing you. You begin with values that are uncompromised, that are grounded in justice. You use rigorous scholarship to understand phenomena, but not just for knowledge creation, but to affect lives and ultimately to engage the public. So thank you also. So the moment we're in, we are in a pandemic that has already revealed that one's ethnicity and race is intricately linked to a greater risk of mortality as well as economic calamity. The fact that something like a pandemic that presumably is supposed to hit us randomly can be so linked to one's identity is indicative of a larger political economy that affords value to one identity and an economy that's overall failing. So for the last 45 years, essentially all the economic gains from America's increasing productivity, they've gone to the elite and upper middle class, while real worker wages have remained roughly flat. I'm going to describe in this conversation the ways in which we, probably in a counterintuitive way, given the theme of this conference, exaggerate the functional role of education to the detriment of understanding the functional roles of resources and wealth itself and understanding inequality. That promise trickled down from neoliberal supply-side economics has never come to fruition. Without capital, without resources, inequality is locked in. We use words like choice and freedom to describe the benefits of a proverbial market, but it is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. Wealth provides us financial agency and economic security to take risk and shield against loss, especially in a pandemic. And the ways in which wealth is generated, it is wealth that begets more wealth. Yet when we frame wealth disparity, particularly along racial lines, including the use of alternative financial service products, we focus on poor financial choices and decision-making on the part of largely Black, Latinx, and other poor borrowers. This framing is tied to a culture of poverty thesis in which Blacks are presumed to have an undervalue and low acquisition of education. That framing is wrong. Indeed, a lot of our framing is wrong. The directional emphasis, the causality is wrong. It is more likely that meager economic circumstances, not poor decision-making or some deficient knowledge, that constrains choice itself and leaves poor borrowers, Black and brown people, with little to no financial options but to attain and use predatory and abusive financial services. Behavior and literacy are practically useless for households that have no finances to manage in the first place. When we consider student debt, it's noteworthy that on average, Black college graduates 4 years after graduation owe about $53,000 in student debt. Despite this misperception that Black people don't value education, there are also Black college graduates that are overrepresented in graduate education relative to their population at large. I believe that they're pursuing a resume building strategy. If they expect they're going to be discriminated against, then they invest in resume building to overcome that potential discrimination. I'm going to ask in this talk, at what cost? We know that high achieving Black Americans measured by education, they still exhibit large economic and health disparities relative to their white peers. And when it comes to health and wealth, not only do these disparities persist, they often grow at higher levels of education. We know that Black families where the head graduated from college typically have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. We know that Black expectant mothers have twice the likelihood of an infant death if they have a college degree relative to white expectant mothers who dropped out of high school. We also know that a Black man with a stroke I'm sorry, a black man with a college degree is 3 times likely to die from a stroke, more so than a white man who dropped out of high school. These are examples of the property rights in whiteness. In essence, education is not the magic antidote for the enormous inherited disparities that result from laws, policies, and economic arrangements. Let me be clear, I do not intend to diminish the value of education. There is intrinsic value along with a public responsibility to expose everyone with a high quality education to synthesize and fuse information into big ideas with encouraging and empathetic teachers to deliver relevant curriculum from grade school all the way through college. But it is a myth that Black families do not value education, and also problematic and related to that myth is the societal overemphasis on the economic returns to education as the panacea to address socially established barriers. Basically, like I said, we overstate its functional role to the detriment of understanding the functional role of wealth. Indeed, I have a provocative question. The emphasis on education to promote economic opportunity, is that a political ruse? In other words, is the rhetorical aspiration of equal opportunity a mechanism, a tactic, so to speak, to facilitate the hoarding of resources for the elite and upper middle class? In other words, does framing inequality as an opportunity gap serve the purpose to reinforce market norms that put the onus of inequality on individuals while absolving the state from public responsibility? We know that Black individuals, men and women between the ages of 25 and 64, have a 50% higher mortality than their white counterparts. And if we look at those with a college degree, that mortality difference rises to 70%. Education is positively associated with better health for all Americans, but racial disparities in health worsen at higher education. Their physical and psychological cost of stigma, and ironically exerting individual agency. So when we ask our women when they're young girls, our Black people when they're young, to work twice as hard to get by, we need to also ask, what are the consequences of that above normal efforts? That speaks to the limited role of education and as a protector for income and health for various people. The prevalence of the politics of personal responsibility is potentially detrimental to Black people's health. So so basically what we need to do is understand the roles of power and capital in our political economy and be more focused on understanding and advocating for structures that truly lead to more equitable and fairer distribution. We are not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by some free will into fair and efficient distribution. Obviously, that ignores the roles of power, capital, and the ways that identity itself may have market return. The good news is that change may be happening. We have witnessed across all 50 states and pretty much the entire globe protesters shouting this summer in solidarity that Black Lives Matter. Younger generations and social movements may be beginning to redefine economic good to embrace the principles of morality, humanity, and sustainability. These are necessary ingredients if we're ever going to have an authentic racial coalition, an authentic coalition across gender, and an authentic coalition across sexual orientation to address the common paradigm of growing inequality. Here's what I encourage us all to do. Change the paradigm. Be bold. Work at federal, state, and local levels. Go into progressive and conservative communities, and then ultimately advocate for programs and initiatives that truly empower people with the economic security, with the dignity and the authentic agency in order to define and achieve their goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Darrick. You've put a lot of ideas and insights on the table for us to dig into this afternoon. We are going to be joined by 3 colleagues in just a moment. They may come up on our screen as I'm talking and introducing them. Yes, there you all are. Let me just say that each person who has just joined us is much more than the namal titles and affiliations that I am going to introduce them by for brevity's sake only. I expect that we will all learn more about each of their experience and worldviews and the approaches that advance as most critical for philanthropy's role in fostering racial justice. We have a lot to learn about each of them and from each of them together. But let me start by just quickly saying, we have Jule Hall with us. He's a program officer with Ascendium Education Group, where he's responsible for its strategic grant making that aims to expand post-secondary education opportunities for incarcerated learners. We're also joined by Tulaine Montgomery, Managing Director at New Profit, where she's got quite a large portfolio and body of work she'll tell us more about. But as part of that, she leads the Inclusive Impact Portfolio launched just earlier this year to increase capital investment and deliver capacity building support for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx social entrepreneurs. And we're also joined by Michelle Molitor, Executive Director of the Equity Lab, which leads individuals, organizations, and collectives in the very necessary work of anti-racism and anti-racist action. So Jule, Tulaine, and Michelle, in that order, you each have about 5 minutes or so to speak, and then we'll all come back together for a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you to everyone joining us virtually. I would like to start with a quote from a late 19th century French aristocrat, Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville said, if you want to learn about American democracy, you need to look inside their prisons. I want to remix that a little bit. I would say if you want to learn about the future of racial justice, we need to pay attention to the site of American prisons. Now, I want to be clear. When I say American prisons, I'm talking literally and figuratively the populations inside and surrounding the prison. We need to pay attention to people who are released from prison and their ability to work, pay their bills, and remain at liberty without violating the law. We need to pay attention to the experiences of men, women, and gender non-conforming people in prison because prison enforces a gender binary. We need to pay attention to the communities that rely on prisons for their own economic stability. How do we do this? I leave it to the audience to be creative and open about this, but I do want to say that education plays a central role. And many of you know my story. I'm an advocate for the transformational power of education. I received a great education through the Bard Prison Initiative, where I wrote a 127-page thesis on German studies during my academic career, and engage myself in a way in which my success in society is based on my ability to engage communities and to solve issues, to bring solutions. I will argue that I'm not unique. There are many people just like me. I'm pretty sure many of you know people who have been incarcerated or are incarcerated and are doing phenomenal advocacy. I actually believe that this is a population of untapped potential that we need to tap into. So for me, the intersectionality of the problems that we face in society, whether it's racism, ableism, economic exploitation, or the enforcement of gender binaries, are located at the site of the prison. For me, I think the intersectionality of it calls for intersectional intervention. One of the best intersectional or systematic interventions that we are engaged with now is post-secondary education for people in prison. I'd like to share some numbers with you. You all probably know these numbers already. There are 2.3 million people incarcerated in jails, prisons, and detention centers in the United States. 1.3 million people are in state prisons where there are relatively few, I would say, post-secondary education opportunities. I would also like to acknowledge only 6% of the people incarcerated have a post-secondary credential. That is by a report conducted by Ithaca SNR. Also, if we take that number and realize that more than 95% of the people who are incarcerated will one day be released, this is something I think we need to pay attention to. This is something that I think calls for educational and workforce training that would prepare people to engage society in constructive manners, the way in which many people who are formerly incarcerated, whether in Florida with the voters' rights movement, in Louisiana, and their efforts in securing voting rights for people who have been incarcerated, places like New York, even New Jersey. There are people who are formerly incarcerated with a civic consciousness that are ready to provide solutions to the issues that we have in society. Now, that's anecdotal information. I will provide one more statistic that you all may know. Every dollar invested in prison education yields $4 to $5 in savings to society. So this is where our charge should be. We need to engage the prison, not just the people inside it, the people around it, and all the issues that we are seeing come up, whether it's race, gender, economics. Even now we're seeing a public health crisis that has some direct relations to prisons. But the main thing that I think the future of racial justice will be able to have a beneficial result from is by engagement with post-secondary education on a systemic level. If we engage low income, people of color, not people who identify as white in the prison system, I believe we will see these people released, engaged in society with solutions for the problems that we are facing today. And with that, I'd like to close. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jule. And thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Professor. You've set us up for a really wonderful, timely conversation today. I want to just talk a little bit about the root intention of philanthropy as a sector. And, you know, times like these, we have raging fires, pandemics, swarms of locusts, literally, right? We have so many things. Racial reconciliation, the sort of unearthing and highlighting of deeply held just dissonance. And at times like this, I'd imagine that many of you who are on this call today, like myself, you know, we go back to the basics in a season such as this. We go back to what is my true intent? What is the legacy that I want to advance? What is the way I want to show up? And I would argue that philanthropy as a sector, that it's time for us to revisit our roots in a similar way. And if you take a look at the etymology of the word philanthropy, it actually means to love humankind. That is the sort of root intent or purpose of this space we're all in. It's to love humankind. And yet, if you look at our practices, our policies, our structure, our staffing, you see that we are not really designed to show love. You know, my mother always taught me that you have to teach people how to love you. And she also taught me that it's really hard and actually impossible to effectively, sustainably love people to whom you do not listen, right? We have to listen to and learn from those we seek to love. And so the point of my comments today are really about what does it mean to flip the structures of philanthropy on its head so that we operate in a way and design and structure ourselves in a way where we actually don't just give people and communities who we administer grants to the chance to sit on boards or committees, but we actually design ourselves in a way where we are investing in the expertise of what I call proximate leaders. And when I say proximate, you know, that's a term that's come into kind of fashion these days. Ryan Stevenson and Just Mercy really brought that term proximity into the forefront for us as a sector, right? I see you, Jule, absolutely. Like, you know, shout out to Brian Stevenson, of course, yeah? But a proximate leader for us is somebody who is not just studying a group of people, not just exposed to a group of people, not someone who has a few friends or a romantic relationship within a certain group of people, but someone who has, through their choices, their identity, their life experience, someone who is deeply guided, informed, and led by the expertise, dreams, agenda, assets, and struggles of a community, right? So in many cases, because of the stratification of opportunity that Professor outlined for us at the top of this session, in many cases, proximate leaders are also Black, Latinx, and Indigenous leaders because of the ways in which, people are really rewarded or targeted based on their identity. But when I talk about proximity, I'm talking about people who are led by the community's networks and constituencies that they are wanting to serve. And that applies to philanthropy. So when we think about proximity, it's interesting because as a society, we're actually very practiced at investing in the expertise of proximity in the private sector, in the business space. Imagine if you had an invention, a consumer product, a technology that you wanted to mass produce to sell with great success. One of the first steps that you would take is you would study your potential clients, your consumers, your customers. There's a whole division of industry in the private sector, research and development. That's about making sure that before any product is launched, there's a deep understanding and knowledge of the people who are meant to in some way interface with that product. So we invest in the expertise of proximity all the time in the private sector. But somehow when we move into the social impact space, we imagine, we sort of design ourselves as if it's possible to know what is most effective and sustainable for a community that we have no knowledge of, no relationship with, and in some cases, minimal regard for. And when I say that, I know that might be hard to hear. It is possible, though, to be data-driven and ignorant at the same time. What I mean by that is because philanthropy is designed in a way where the metrics of success and of excellence are often, proxy for pedigree based on socioeconomic stratification in the society, it's very easy for us to conduct a body of research that tells us that a group of people we want to support are defined by some set of deficits. We talked earlier about the notion that the economic inequities we see for communities of color are driven by individual choices and behavior. But we know that that's not actually the case. It's really about systemic barriers and different degrees of protection for different groups of people in this country. So when I talk about proximity and philanthropy and I talk about love, I'm saying that we need to just be bold and be clear that the only way we as a sector have a shot at having transformative change, of really seizing this moment that we can all feel is right in front of us, is if we design structures and systems that, one, create spaces for us as philanthropists to hear the truth. Because of the power differentials in philanthropy, it is really hard once you get into a role where you are seen as in some way controlling resource allocation or funding or grant making. It gets really hard to hear the truth about the impact of what you're doing. I remember when I moved into philanthropy, a good friend said, that is going to be the last, you will never again have to pay for a meal, and you will have a hard time hearing the truth about things. You're going to have to work harder to hear what is honest. And so part of what I believe is essential is for funders and people who work with foundations and individual philanthropists, it's important for us to find ways to create spaces where we can hear the truth from the people who we are working with, investing in, and making grants to about the impact of our policies. We have to be willing to hear that maybe we got it wrong, despite the studies that we drew from when we designed our grant-making portfolios. And then we have to move from truth-telling to reconciliation, because part of the truth is that we have done some things with great intention that have caused harm and that have advanced gaps and inequities. Once we can reconcile that, we can then do effective redesign, partnering with communities, partnering with proximate leaders, redefining the role of community in the architecture of our grant-making practices and structures. And then we can actually be on a meaningful equity, not journey, I don't like the word journey, but practice. Equity is a practice, just like anything else you want to be good at, whether it's fitness, playing an instrument, playing a sport, whatever it is. We know in certain realms that we have to practice whatever it is we want to be good at. And so we should just let go of the idea that we'll get to some end game place where we'll have it mastered. We won't. But if we get good at creating spaces for truth telling, reconciling where we've caused harm without intent, and then redesigning and in partnership with proximate leaders, we have a shot at the kind of transformed sector that actually makes good on its original intent, which is to love humankind. Thank you.
It's hard to follow all of that, but y'all are preaching a word this morning or afternoon. Really excited to also share. I think, I want to thank everyone who shared before. I've been taking notes. But I want to pick up on this idea of love and what love really means in all of this, which sometimes I think is an uncomfortable way to view this work, but it really has to come from that place. Because if we are not coming from that place, we have no opportunity to be in Darrick's authentic coalition. We have no opportunity to see the real humanity of people in prison and coming out of prison. We have no opportunity to look within ourselves and understand that we may have been part of the problem, but we are also a part of the solution. And so the work that we do and what we want to offer from the Equity Lab in partnership with GFE is an opportunity to engage in relationship and to revitalize what it means to do this work effectively. And so what we offer, and we'll be sharing more information with you, is a Nexus Fellowship specifically for Grantmakers for Education members, where we have the opportunity to do that exploration of self, to understand systems of oppression, to understand the disinvestment and the inhumanity that has led to all of the inequity that we see across the board. There's a quote from Richard Rohr that's come up this week in some of his daily meditations that is crucial in our understanding of evil as being, first of all, a social agreement. And so as we think about all of the social agreements that have created such deep inequity, such disregard for people, such disinvestment, oppression, inhumanity, we have to explore that in deep and meaningful ways. We also have to be willing to break down the silos that keep all of us apart. There are a lot of ways that when we are doing this work, we think of ourselves as being precious, or our work is precious. And we are not willing to do the excavation that's necessary to really get beneath the surface so that you can enact those changes that Tulaine was talking about. And so really this offering in partnership with GFE is one to invite you into a long year-long experience where we're going very deep with you. We're looking at self, we're looking at a decolonized adaptive leadership, we're looking at decolonized technical leadership. We're looking at what does it mean to have equity from the very beginning of this. And we're doing it in community, intentionally in community with each other, where we have the opportunity for transformation, for true liberation, and to make real change on the ground within your own communities. So I'm looking forward to talking more about it, but it really is about this opportunity to go deeper and to be supported in that journey and to break down the silos that are not serving any of us.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm so excited now for the next 40 minutes of our time together, even more so than I was before. So we have, I've thought about how to kind of structure this conversation, but I also hope that we all feel free to take it where it goes and respond to one another and really engage with one another. And sometimes this kind of format makes that hard. But accounting for the little bit of delay that we all have, I think we can have some rich conversation here. I think what I'd like to do is think about a conversation that has an arc where we really understand the nature of the problem, right? What is racial injustice in education? What, if we look at the system as a birth to post-secondary care and education system, what are the various ways in which these systems and structures are implicated in injustice and inequality? Separating those two, because in my understanding, those are not the same. I would love to hear you all talk about how these systems are implicated really in this phenomenon, but then also feel free to put forward, the kind of a solution orientation that really helps us understand what racial justice is and what racial justice in education is. We've talked about a couple of things so far, but I'd like to just be a bit more pointed in this kind of part of our conversation here. So Darrick, I would love to start with you and then open it up, and I might just at different points in the conversation ask folks to chime in, but I have a feeling no one's going to be quiet here. So,
you mentioned the word systems. I'm going to start with the first and only Black Nobel laureate in economics, Arthur Lewis, where he talked about competing and non-competing groups. He said that if you're trying to make a system of social hierarchy, one stage you can render someone non-competing. So if education is the credential that gets rewarded in the marketplace, you can structure a society that advantages some and not others with regards to getting that credential. Then you will have some seepage where individuals are able to get that credential. That's where discrimination comes into play in full force. That if you want to, you change the rules, you outright discriminate. So, I'm trying to make 2 points: that we're structured in a way that limits the access to a lot of individuals to the credential based on an identity. But we also need to recognize that even when they get that credential, if the system is designed in a way, and this is something philanthropy needs to understand also, in my view, racism is not the result of simple bigotry, hatred, and ignorance. That there's a lot of intentionality with regards to who will take, who will have, who will hoard, us versus them. There are economic returns to racism for certain classes of individuals. I could say a lot more about that, but I won't for now, unless it comes back. But I'll just say that understanding that structure and competing that structure, going against that structure is where we need to go. You asked the question of what we can do to achieve racial justice. That structure is fueled by an economic notion of benefit, of self-interested accumulation that knows no bounds. That if we just have that framing of well-being as I'm going to get as much as I can, then you will use everything at your disposal, even your identity, to get what you can. An alternative structure, and this is not pie in the sky, is to invest in common humanity, to invest in human decency and dignity. If there is some notion of collective efficacy, humanity amongst us, then the benefits to white privilege, the immoral benefits of white privilege, have less saliency. So I think ultimately these are the things we need to do if we want to have the society that you just described.
Mm-hmm.
What did I just describe? Sorry.
I mean, if I may jump in, everything you said resonates, and I'm going to go back to a point I made earlier and connect it to how we define systems, because part of the challenge when we talk about systems change and systems transformation is sometimes we're all talking about different things, right? One, telling the truth. So we're hearing increasingly of late the truth about structural racism and the ways in which racial and ethnic identity are that there's an economic currency attached to different identity groups. And sometimes we haven't collectively told the truth about that, right? I would also encourage this group, if you're not already familiar, to check out Andre Perry's book, Know Your Price, which tells the truth about the ways in which Black wealth is structurally, systematically, and powerfully devalued in ways that we can point to, touch, measure, evaluate, report on, et cetera. So that truth telling often is about learning the reality of the impacts of our existing systems. But I do think it's important to have some agreement around the dimensions and conditions of systems. And so I'm a big fan of an article called The Water of Systems Change by John Kenya and Peter Senge. And they talk about 6 conditions that I'll just quickly name because I do think it's important to consider. At the root of systems change conditions is what we call mental models, your beliefs. Do you believe that this country is in the sort of current disaggregation of wealth is a result of sort of individualism and meritocracy? Do you believe that there are structures that create different protections and access for different groups? What is the mental model that drives the structures you design? Really getting honest about that and being clear about where there are inherent blind spots and falsehoods integrated into the mental model. Mental models are essential, but they are implicit. They can be hard to name. And so it's really important to interrogate the mental models of any philanthropy, school district. Like, what do we believe about the students, about the teachers, about the families? Tell the truth about that, because that is driving everything. I don't believe you can have a broken mental model and an equitable policy structure or talent pipeline. But then you have to look at power dynamics, networks. Who knows who? Who can get a superintendent on the phone? Who can get a program officer on the phone? Who can get an individual philanthropist on the phone? Who can say without consequence, I'm having trouble implementing this activity. Will you help me? Will you fund me while I figure it out? Figuring out what power dynamics and relationships exist and being honest about that is critically important if we're talking about systems change. And then when we do that foundational work, I believe, that's when we can get to equitable transformative policies, equitable transformative funding systems, and equitable and transformative hiring practices. But we often start with the external structures because it's comfortable. It's safer. But I would argue that when we start there and only remain there, that at best we're doing incremental change that's not sustainable versus transformative, sustainable, systems reinvention.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would add, I would refer back to my claim of intersectionality and the way in which the prison is the site where we find so many of the inequities in society represented here. And the fact that 95% of the people incarcerated now will be released one day is something I think we should be paying attention to for our own sake, as well as for the humanity of the people who are inside. It's important to note that education had a role, as you mentioned, Nicole, in the mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies. I grew up in a New York City school system that didn't show interest in developing my intellectual capabilities. In fact, I could recall once where I was confused about what I wanted to do in life, and I had the idea to go to the Army because that was the thing for people where I grew up in the inner city. Is either you become a rapper, a sports star, or you go to the Army. In any case, when I went to my school counselor to ask about what would be involved, my school counselor pushed a pen and paper at me and told me, sign here. So I felt devalued. I felt school wasn't for me. I felt these people were more concerned with searching me and making sure that I understand a lesson of punitiveness rather than trying to develop my intellectual capabilities. So there's no doubt that the school system is implicated in this. However, we need to understand as well that in order for systemic change to occur, we need multi-sector partnerships. We need multi-engagement with different aspects of social issues. And education provides that intersectionality. You can learn how to be intersectional, how to look at the macro as well as the micro. And what I'm saying is that I think people, well, I know, particularly if we're talking about people who are currently or formerly incarcerated, many were just like me who didn't understand the value of education or were misled to believe that they were inherently criminal or inherently bad. And once we had that space to say, wait, I'm not that. And not only am I not that, my community doesn't represent that. We took the tools that we provided, that the intersectional tools, the public health tools, the training, right back to our community. So for me, there's a way in which we know the problem is the education system, but we need to use it to empower people to come up with creative, intersectional ways to engage racism and all the isms, ableism, sexism, because this is where we will have the most impact. One last quick point. Prisons are obscure from society. We need to see that as a problem. We need to engage with, and it's happening. It's happening. Correction officials are on board with post-secondary education for people incarcerated. So we just need to support these multi-sector relationships and formations and bring some light to this area and have the people in and surrounding these places take leading roles in the problems we see in society today.
Yeah. I think the only thing I will add to this part of the conversation is that I think the education sector generally has an ahistoric view of education. So we don't steep ourselves and a deep understanding of none of these systems are broken. They're doing exactly what they were built to do. And education is not outside of that. Healthcare is not outside of that. Wealth building is not outside of that. And so I deeply believe that a huge part of what education needs to do is deeply understand the history of this country, deeply understand how those systems have been set up and used in your community. So learn your community, talk about proximity. People often move and live in places and have zero idea what has happened in the past to people of color, Black people, Indigenous folk, other folks of color have zero idea about the migratory patterns. And I think migration is a generous way to put people fleeing from genocide, essentially. And so I think if we don't understand the history and don't understand how those systems were built on purpose, we will inadvertently bake inequity into whatever it is that we are creating for the future. And so my greatest encouragement is learn your history, be able to understand and link how it shows up in today's current context and in all the ways it's showing up in the systems that currently exist. And what are the things that you need to unlearn, transfer, change, figure out differently as you think about your design for an equitable future? Because what got us here is not what we want for the future. And so we've got to be really clear about that.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to respond to things that folks have already said?
I mean, I'll make a couple points real quick. And one is, prisons, segregation, control of family formation and reproduction. Those are ways that neoliberal societies manage surplus populations. Those are ways that they render and deem a certain group of people as a surplus population. A follow-up question might be, well, why do we need surplus populations? Unfortunately, they serve the interests of two things. One, they keep labor costs low, they keep various costs low, but they also discipline society to maintain hierarchy. So you end up with white working class individuals that take a middle position and with a society of growing inequality, and they're disciplined by that surplus population in two ways. One is, if you don't act accordingly, there go you. And then the other way is they're offered relative status. That's where white privilege comes in. However unequal we become in society, at least they're not a surplus population. And sadly, in our human context, we value absolute status as well as relative status. And I'm talking in theoretic terms, but ultimately we need to de-emphasize that relative positioning and focus on some shared prosperity. One other last point I'll make is that when people talk about equity leading to that if we get rid of racism, that's going to improve the economy for everyone. That may be true. It's context specific, because you can also grow an economy in the traditional ways we define an economy, through exploitation and extraction, by taking the surplus and reinvesting it. To me, I don't like that terminology. I think the studies are credible and produce a good deal of evidence. And the reason I don't like it is because humanity should not be reduced to a dollar value. There are certain economic rights that should be just essential to people, period, and shouldn't be compromised.
So I want to drill down a little bit more, because I think we share a language here in this conversation that also I don't take for granted, right? I don't think everyone, to the point that you were making earlier, Tulaine, has the same definitions in mind. So I want to ask us all to actually think about kind of some of the micro and macro that Jule raised earlier as we conceive of racism and racial justice. I have had the occasion recently to be reading some of Beverly Daniel Tatum's work, love her, another rock star. And she defines racism not as a personal ideology based on racial prejudice, but rather as a system of cultural messages and institutional policies and practices that deliver, that reify advantage based on race, and that allocate power according to that scheme, right? In the form of social, cultural, political, economic resources. And I think we hear that type of definition talked about more maybe colloquially when people say that, racism is institutionally held but individually practiced. And so, reflecting on how you all conceive of racial justice, and also perhaps conceive of racism as both this structural dynamic and one that also has a real effect on people's individual and collective lives. I wonder and ask each of you to kind of reflect on, whether education is the space, the arena to really solve these multidimensional and layered and maybe both and types of problems. And to take that one step further, to ask, the capacity of education philanthropy, more specifically, to situate itself in both of these spaces. I feel like so many of our grants really are focused on delivering services to individuals for a whole host of reasons. We have program areas, we fund programs. Some of us fund policy advocacy or community organizing, but there's all sorts of considerations I know that are at play. But what of this kind of either or, both and proposition about how we conceive of racism, and so in turn, how we then conceive of racial justice and philanthropy's orientation toward it?
I think my initial answer is no. No, education cannot solve this without deeply understanding how education is tied to every other system. You can't look at housing without also thinking about all the ways that housing is surrounded by transportation, surrounded by healthcare, surrounded by childcare, surrounded by all of these other ways that these systems interact with each other. And so my gut reaction is that this wasn't started in education alone, and it won't be solved in education alone. And if we are not more creative and thoughtful about cross-sector relationships and work that doesn't place ourselves as we're doing it right and somebody else is doing it wrong, but instead says this is a problem that's much bigger than any one of us individually, and we have to work collectively in order to create the solutions that don't repeat past sin to people. And so I don't. Yeah, I'm so curious what the rest of the panel thinks, but I don't think it'll be solved in education alone.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
Good. Okay, I'll go. So we're agreeing with like enthusiastic agreement. So I'll quickly say I would agree with the no. And in terms of the education philanthropy, I think that I believe that education philanthropy has to be more loving and more bold, right? And so what that means to me is, ideally we can get outside of this cult of programs approach to change and really move towards investing in, valuing, exploring, interrogating systemic approaches, right, with our philanthropy. Because in many cases, philanthropy is well positioned to be sort of the R&D, the innovation space, the space where we test an idea, explore an idea, build a model, build a coalition. Like we actually have the freedom to do that in education philanthropy. And ideally, if we're operating in what I would see as our sort of highest and best space, we're not not waiting for precedent and then saying, okay, we'll try it. We're saying, you know what? We've got to create a space where there's a multi-sector coalition that is telling the truth and doing rapid adaptation of policies and practices in ways that flip power differentials on their head. Like, we are poised to do that today as a sector. And I believe that education philanthropy needs to do that in order to play its highest, best, most impactful role with education reform. We won't be able to program our way out of structural, systemic, historical inequity. There is no program model. There is no level of scale that will transform the context in which young people are living and learning. So I believe, like, just owning that, accepting that, and moving away from what I call the cult of programs towards more systemic approaches and multi-sector partnerships is essential. And we need the kind of leaders in philanthropy who are up for it, who can tolerate a difficult, maybe even impolite conversation and not say that person's not ready for this particular grant or this particular opportunity. Like, we need to step in. I think now really is the season for it.
I totally agree. You said a lot of what I wanted to say. I would just emphasize that it's important to recognize that multi-sector partnership. Education, everyone is at fault. We have responsibility if we don't pay attention. We don't have to commit the act. We have responsibility if we're not paying attention. So for me, education philanthropy needs to move out of a silo of only being engaged with education, because education is the space in which we learn about social issues. For me, there's a way in which education philanthropy is in a better position, not the only. This is not a situation where we'll have one resolution. We need the combination of resources from multiple sectors. And I believe education philanthropy is at a good position. I would love to see education philanthropy engage with social justice philanthropy, criminal justice reform, gender rights. I want to see these silos broken, because that's how the community and the people who make the decisions in philanthropy are not proximate. We need some proximity here. We need proximity between sectors, as well as proximity between the sector and the community, whether that is board members going to communities and learning what's going on there, getting proximate, in the words of Brian Stevenson, which I love, or bringing the community to the board. I really see that we could create a framework, just the way we create frameworks for grant making for an organization that's concerned with disability justice, to have a scholarship for a year for a person with a disability to be on that board and to listen in and take part in the discussions. So for me, I understand these are long-term problems. However, I want to be pragmatic about what can be done right now, because we are at a state of crisis right now on so many fronts. So I think it's all hands on board, and education is in a unique position, not only from its engagement with these issues, but also with its research and its ability to illustrate what's really going on in the world. Well, I won't say really going on, because there's a need for impacted experience or anecdotal information as well. But I don't want to deny the need for data and the need for research to point us in that direction where we could corroborate it with anecdotal and impacted information.
So the answer is no, like everyone said, but that doesn't mean philanthropy should stop investing in education, because education in and of itself is important as an outcome. Again, the role that education plays in breaking down socially established structures that has been already pointed out are without a knowledge of history. A knowledge of history would demonstrate are one, intentional or there, but as an outcome, that's reason enough to invest. If philanthropy is part of the problem, if they're using a frame of trying to incentivize insinuated defective individuals to be more responsible and have better outcomes, that's a problematic frame. The most parsimonious approach to address inequality is resources itself. Capital, we think about as an outcome, but its essence is functional. Its essence is to be able to do Know-how is useful, know-how is critical, but it's irrelevant if you don't have that capital in the first place. And the last critical ingredient, I'll say, is some political codification to ensure that the returns on your capital don't get extracted from you and exploited from. I will remind everybody thinking about history, next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa riots in a case where we had some Black entrepreneurship and educational success, and it was literally taken by terrorism.
Powerful.
Mm-hmm. So we had a resounding no to the answer to that question, with a lot of yeses to the position and potential and what could be the promise for education work and education philanthropy as part of it. I would love to dig in further, just kind of getting closer and closer, I think, to the ground, and ask you to talk a little bit more, because some of these things have come up already, about the ideas and assumptions we should be challenging, and some of these have been raised, and I think also that we should be embracing, so that we're not completely centering on some deficit orientation, even for our sector and our work. And I would love to talk about where we might expect to encounter resistance in this transformative work we may all undertake in our for ourselves individually, in our organizations, and in the sector broadly. And when I talk about resistance, whether it's, explicit, whether it's tacit and quietly seeped into, and also how we might consider addressing some of that resistance.
So I'll start quickly. One of the things that we need to change is the narrative. I really have been impacted personally by the notion of inherent criminality and the way we demonize populations. We do need some sort of narrative change, and it's still prevalent today. It was rebirthed with the idea of super predators and crack babies in the 90s. We have it being used in regards to immigrants and immigrant populations now. As long as that narrative, as long as people are identifying the other as unworthy and inherently unfit, we will not make progress. So I just want to put that out there about narrative change.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, and I will follow you again, and to say that I think in philanthropy, if we're looking at philanthropy, a couple of things. One are sort of traditional mainstreamed elite ivory tower notions of expertise are biased, insufficient, and frankly oppressive. I mean, if we go to the history, if we go to the mental models that inform those biases, they're steeped in ideas of where does genius reside, where does goodness and character reside, inherent criminality of distinct groups of people. And just all of that is it's constructed, like we can actually point to the historical documents. Notes on the State of Virginia by Jefferson is one, where this notion of one group of people being inherently less trustworthy and competent than another was introduced formally and hardwired into our economic structures, because this group has these character traits or flaws as defined by our founders at the time, that therefore means they are fit for these roles. And that's how we can be founders who love the Lord and love liberation, but also advance chattel slavery at the same time. We construct this notion of race and inherent characteristics and flaws associated with that construct of race. So this is architected by humans, right? Which is disheartening, enraging, but it also is energizing for me, because if humans made it, humans can make something else. This is not inherent. It does not have to be this way. We could have a refounding of this country in this time if we so choose. The opportunity is there. So I would say we have to get rid of our elite ivory tower notions of expertise and recognize that they are actually not only limited, but they're frankly oppressive and by design. We also have to overturn our calculus around risk in philanthropy. We have a whole set of definitions of risk that are broken, biased, destructive. And so, I see heads nodding, and so folks can say with more eloquence than I how we might need to change those calculuses. But we just redefine risk. It is actually a higher risk to ignore the genius, innovation, and adaptability of proximate leaders and of community. That is actually the greater risk. And I'll stop there.
And I thought that was great. I'll try to build upon that and say, the framework is, unless we change the ways in which we value outcomes, economic value, philanthropy is based on capital, based on the wealthy. They're benefiting from a system that there's a certain irony, but the current system and the current values. I'll build upon the previous comment. Inequality and despair are a choice. We can make a different choice. So if we have different values and different choices, we can change the outcome. We should be looking to fund ourselves out of business, not in terms of being frivolous with our resources, but rather we should be funding to get rid of the problem. And that leads to the point that was previously made: take big, bold risks. Try to do something that's transformative. Angela Glover Blackwell has made this point about philanthropy doing the work of government too much. Obviously, we don't need to abandon poor people if government's not doing their job. I'm not saying that, but the best role for philanthropy, in my view, is to facilitate big, bold initiatives that can be used and implemented in a public way, to be long-standing, sustainable, and not at the whim of charitable notions.
Yes, all of this. I'm like, woo, fund ourselves out of business. Yes. The only thing I will add that occurred to me immediately is something that Tulaine shared earlier about truth and what it means to get to the source of truth in this, and the excavation that's necessary. I think sometimes people think, I was in a conversation earlier today, and a leader was admitting that, I dread coming into every conversation about racial equity and social justice because it makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I don't want to see those truths. I don't want to think about those things as being a part of me or something that I have to unlearn. And so I think us coming to the table with more truth, not being something steeped in shame, but being steeped in something that allows us to grow and to create the change we want to see in the world. And so just a reframing of what we mean by truth. And then I also, the only other thing I will say is that humanity and human rights is not political. And we as a country have politicized every single factor in favor of certain folks and certain identities, but we've politicized it in such a way that people's human dignity and their humanity comes under political attack on the regular. And that shouldn't be. I'm a queer woman married to a gorgeous, tall Black woman with locks, and I shouldn't feel like my ability to be married to my partner is under attack through politics. And I do think that, or my identity as a woman, my identity as a mixed Black woman, like all of these other things should not be up for, this is my life. And so I feel like the clearer we get that these are not political musings, but instead are people's lives and their humanity, and to get clearer about that and not play with it, the better off we will be as we design solutions for the future.
Yeah, I'd say something real quick that, a raceless identity, a genderless identity, that's such a privilege and almost the definition of dominance, that you're able to sit in perpetual judgment of everyone else and their other. Because, if you have a subaltern identity that's imposed on you by society, you go through your life thinking about it. Every interaction, you start questioning, is it because I'm race I'm getting this price? Is it because that is one of the biggest burdens of having these stratifications based on one's identity?
Mm-hmm.
I can just say, I mean,
Agreed.
just Michelle, I love that. And Michelle, what you just said made me think of something I've been wrestling with that I do not have the answer to. So it's going to be unsatisfying, but I have to share it because it's a challenge in this highly polarized context where issues of humanity are politicized and where the line between sort of news, media, and propaganda is getting blurrier every day. What is the role of education philanthropy, right? Like we are in a regulatory context where many of us are 501c3 organizations. We have seen a recent example of beliefs in literature being rendered almost illegal, critical race theory, and the degree to which one can or cannot teach critical race theory and actually receive funding from government, right? And so what does it mean to be a compliant 501c3 funding institution in this day and time is a very interesting question. And how can we not let compliance be an exit ramp from taking a stand to do what is right from a humanitarian perspective? And I think that more of us have to be willing to love fiercely, you know, and to consider where the regulatory environment is being used to constrain us from taking bold stands against inhumane, inequitable policies and practices. And so I leave that with you so that I'm not suffering alone in this wrestling, but it is something that I think we have to pay attention to and have conversations about. In polite company, let's talk about what does compliance look like in a highly polarized political environment such as this.
Good trouble.
Good trouble. That's just really quickly, what came up for me when you said that is the idea that I got from many people in the disability justice movement that identifies themselves. What we're talking about is justice. This is a definition of racial justice that is not concerned with compliance or laws. It's about justice. It's a step above to make sure that humanity is being respected and valued.
I wanted to give a moment in case anyone else wanted to jump in. I think one of the things I think about often is the way in which philanthropy is really largely held unaccountable. Maybe to, within the organizations, to the board to produce certain types of documents, to make certain types of cases, to, make sure that we're constantly kind of monitoring the grants and et cetera, and reading reports and making decisions based on that. But really, in the scheme of things, who are we held accountable to, and for what? And I would say, in the scheme of things, we're not held to account very often. So my question to you all is, what should funders be held accountable for, and to whom, for the work to advance racial justice? We're very excited. The survey tells us we're very excited and we feel a great deal of urgency in doing this work. But what does it mean to do it well? And what should we be held accountable for, and to whom in doing it well?
I mean, I'll jump in to say I actually see it a bit differently. I believe that funders and philanthropy is held accountable to those who are the holders of economic resource. And we see it play out. Think about when you prepare for a board meeting with your trustees, a critical mass of whom are your key and lead donors. So there is accountability, but it is to arguably one member of the ecosystem, and it's disproportionate and weighted inequitably. So I would say that there is an accountability. And so to me, the work is how do we expand and shift accountability? Just like I think that, all investing, in my opinion, is impact investing. It all has an impact. It all has a social impact, right? And so how can we just start to tell ourselves the truth about the accountability structures that exist and the impacts that are occurring? So with that said, who should be accountable? Again, if we believe that the expertise of the assets, aspirations, and ideas reside in community and in proximate leaders, if we believe that, if that is the mental model that informs our system, then it only makes sense that community, that beneficiaries, that proximate leaders, that those are the people and the stakeholders who should be able to define what victory and success looks like, who should have a say in what success metrics look like along the way, who should be involved in tracking progress and designing adaptations to existing program structures. Like, it should reside in the hands of the beneficiaries, the community, the people who are often seen as the ones to be in some way educated or improved, are actually the ones who have the expertise and knowledge that we need to solve the problem. So I would say tell the truth that there are accountability structures. It's the wealthy, the resource holders. We're all accountable to them, and we see it play out. Think about your board meetings and I'm telling the truth. But if we want to go beyond that, how can we create accountability structures that center proximate leaders, center communities, center those who we've often defined as merely beneficiaries of our ideas?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree. However, I want to say we're living in a new, unique time. We just had an instance where major philanthropy was basically called upon by impacted people. We had a situation where people impacted by prisons actually protested outside of an office. So I'm seeing, one thing that I really want to recognize about this new age, this new normal that we're living in, there's a level of consciousness that is happening in communities itself. So while this is ideal, I think it's the community that should hold philanthropy accountable. This is why there needs to be that proximity between the two.
Mm-hmm.
I think to build on that, or a curiosity that's rolling around in my mind that I just want to kind of put out there is, I do hear that that philanthropy is held accountable and should be held accountable by the community and is held accountable by the board and the trustees. I have a question about who's holding the trustees and the board accountable, and what that looks like in meaningful ways. Because if we're really trying to create an equitable future that is transformational and liberatory, not just in word, but also in action and practice, then what's the work that needs to happen at that level? What's the disruption that has to happen at that level that can lead to truly meaningful, honestly, ideological change? So it's the ideological change that could happen at that level would change systems, would in turn change institutions, would in turn, and I actually believe that liberation works the other way around. But what are the ways that we are kind of simultaneously having, the public accountability of philanthropy, while also, just because you have the most money, not letting you off the hook for the work that you have to do?
I see government as having the fiduciary social responsibility for its people. That is its purpose. It is unfortunate that philanthropy is filling a void, and it kind of relates to some of the points that I've heard Angela Glover Blackwell make also about the various roles of different entities. But, related is corporate responsibility. When people use that word, what is the role of corporate responsibility, philanthropic responsibility? The end is it's government's responsibility and it's people's responsibility to make governments take responsibility. So we need social movement. We need movements that demand that it is our government, our money, our economy, and that government fulfills its responsibility. It would be great if philanthropy was free to invest in aesthetic desires of collective interests. If they want to, build a ballet, not that ballet is not the role of public also, but the whole problem is our current structure that we, don't have a government that's living up to what it is they should be doing.
So our time is flying by, and I'm really enjoying this conversation so far. I am, before we kind of close out this portion of the session, though, I wanted to do a quick speed round, final remarks that each of you may have. And Michelle, you get some more airtime in a little bit too. But If you could each just take, 30 seconds and, share what you want to leave us with today, that would be wonderful.
I guess I'll go first again. I don't have to, but I'll defer the last word to somebody and just end on making the points that racism is strategic. Racism is not just the product of bigotry. That I encourage philanthropy to reject the neoliberal notions, the neoliberal paternalistic notions that ignorance, grit, and then personal perseverance are the sources of inequality, and recognize the agency that capital and resources have in and of themselves in addressing people's social mobility and economic security. And then what do I want to say lastly? Lastly, that fuel these young people who seem to be making a generational break from my generation. I can't say the civil rights generation because they did a lot of great work, but my generation that bought into this notion that all I have to do is go to the Ivy League school and work hard and pull my pants up and I'll be fine. And it is those other blacks who aren't doing right. These young people are demanding justice. They're addressing climate change, women's rights, black rights, etc. So hopefully this is not something that they'll change over their life course, but really indicative of a change.
And I would just end with, or I would like to conclude with one idea about the fact that the disproportionality that we are seeing of Black and brown people impacted by mass incarceration and its connected systems puts us in a position to do something constructive for a change. And in my view, engage that space in a way that is thinking outside the box, that is transformational, because we see early indications of people like myself, and I'm not the only one, who have rose from that situation and made a bigger, better impact on society. This is the advocacy for impacted people in these spaces. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to be with all of you today. I would say that, a decolonized imagination is not only the realm of the chronologically young. We can choose to decolonize our minds and our visions at any time. We can choose to be brave and love deeply and fiercely at any moment. And I do think now is the moment. I would say for the education philanthropist on this call, if you think about stages of equity engagement, first step is to care. And there is sort of a shared caring about equity and racial justice that we haven't historically seen. And that's important, but it's insufficient. Once you care, you have to commit resources, time, and a study to understanding what is the truth, what are the impacts of your practices. That means you have to create spaces for your grantees, your partners, your stakeholders to tell you the truth about the impacts, positive and challenging, of your structures to date. Then after committing resources, you have to evaluate what you're doing, what bolsters or hinders your ability to be an agent of equity. Then after you evaluate, you got to make the change. And then once you make the change, you have to influence others in your space to do the same. In philanthropy, we are often seeking precedence. And so I think it's important for those of us on this call who care about these issues we've discussed today to commit to ourselves that it's not only about what we do within our portfolio, within our funding institution, it's also about how we influence our peers and hold our peers accountable. Nicole, to your question about where does accountability reside? In philanthropy, we all know that we pay attention to what other funders and funding institutions are doing. So when you go through these stages of equity engagement that I just named, make sure that the final stage for you, or the stage you live in, frankly, it's never over, is to influence your peers to go through their own stages. And it's not linear and there's not an end date. This is a circular, cyclical experience, but we have to go through those stages, I think, to transform and hold one another accountable. That's where the power resides.
Mm-hmm.
I will close just with my deep belief in what is possible for the future. It's the reason that I do all of the work I do. It's the reason I was a teacher and a principal for 20 years. It's the reason that I run the Equity Lab. And I think that can happen through really seeing seeing ourselves as part of the solution, and doing that in loving dignity and in community with each other in meaningful ways. And the last thing I'll say is that, there was an order to things, whether or not it was an order that actually served everybody. We know it didn't serve everybody, but we are in this unique time of disorder, and this doesn't come all the time. So how do we take this disorder and use it to reorder ourselves in a new, meaningful, thoughtful way for the future? And I'm excited to do that with the folks on this panel for sure, but also just with all of you in the future. So looking forward to what's to come.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all and this conversation today. I think you are helping us bring a lot of things together that we've been covering through conference week, but also over the course of all the kind of year-round virtual programming that GFE has been doing. Now more than ever, this conversation was needed and necessarily important. So thank you, Darrick and Jule and Tulaine and Michelle. If we were in a big hotel ballroom, you'd be getting a round of applause from the hundreds of people in the audience. So hopefully all of our virtual snaps and sounds that we can't hear are still landing on you well. So thank you. I encourage everyone out there to continue learning. Follow these folks on Twitter or your other kind of social media platforms of choice. And also, to Michelle's point, to really continue this conversation in your own organizations and the other communities of which you are a part. So thank you. I turn it over to Michelle and I think Celine also to talk to us about a unique opportunity coming up with the Equity Lab. Thank you.
Oh, Celine, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry. Mind blown. Thank you all. I'm the only one who gets to cheer you, and so let me cheer you very, very loudly. I tend in the end like this to take down a few notes and then say, here are some highlights of things people said. My 10 pages of notes, I can't do this justice. You all really did just a real service, I think, to our members and to going really deep on a needed conversation. So thank you all so much. Michelle stayed up here with me just to kind of underscore this new partnership that we're getting underway. There's going to be more information on our website by the end of the day. But what we've heard from all of our members, not just in the most recent survey, but also, since I arrived, is GFE has done some of the 101 level. We ourselves have done some of the 101 level on equity and racial justice, and we really, many of us would like to go much deeper. And so this partnership is intended to do that. Also, many of you have said to me, we've done a lot of this work on DEI within our own organizations, and we'd like the opportunity to do it across organizations. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish here as well. So really excited to offer this Nexus partnership, not only for those of us in philanthropy. It's going to be a small, intensive program over the course of next year. We are working on lots of other different things for other members to do that might be a little less intensive, might be more affinity group based. I've been talking to Tulaine because obviously she brings so much to the table, and others. And so, Michelle, if you want to say a couple more words, but that's really the kind of the why behind it. That's why we thought it was really important to get this work underway at GFE, and why we held it for the last day to say, where do we go from here? We hear you loud and clearly, and we think this is really, really important. Michelle, you want to say a few things?
Yeah. So the Nexus Fellowship, just one, I'm excited to do this with GFE for all of the reasons, not the least of which is my background in education. But really, the Nexus Fellowship itself is an opportunity to do that. To go so much deeper, to be in community with each other, to feel like you're not alone in the things that you're struggling with. You noticed on the panel even that we had a lot of things where we were like, I don't know the answer yet. And so being able to do that work and engage in that beautiful struggle with other people is critical to this work. And so just so you know what you, and this again will be available on the website, but what you get out of this is a true community of people that are coming together with you, meeting regularly over the course of a year. You're also getting lots of interim help. And so each person who is a part of the fellowship will receive individual coaching as well as organizational coaching. We do webinars and other additional things in the interim. We also, when we can get back together, we'll be doing essentially these mini 3-day sessions, approximately quarterly, where we would come together on a Tuesday, we'd spend a full day together on a Wednesday, and we would spend the morning together on a Thursday. But the deep learning that can happen when you're in deep relationship with other people who are also struggling and grappling with the same things you are is powerful. They lead to personal transformation. It also can lead to organizational transformation. And so really want to encourage folks, we will be having the application go live in early December. Information sheet will be available on the Grantmakers for Education website very soon. Applications will be due in early February. Mid-February to early March, we'll be doing some virtual introductions and interviews. And then mid to late March, we'll actually be announcing the cohort that's coming out of this GFE collaboration. And then we will start our work together in earnest in April 2021. And so just really excited to continue this. We will have opportunities for folks to come together and ask more questions. You'll have an opportunity to talk to other Nexus fellow graduates. But we want to make this as open and clear as possible for you all as you think about your journeys individually and institutionally, and how, as a sector, we can be thinking about grant making in education.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much to Nicole. I think she did a great job on the panel. Thank you to all of our panelists. I learned a ton. I have so much that I wish I could go talk to members about, but we'll be doing that in other formats. So thank you all. I want to finally say, don't forget we have one more session, a deep dive this afternoon. We have some brain date time, mindfulness and movement, and then supporting aspiring leaders of color to be superintendents. That's going to happen at 3:30 Eastern. So please join us, and thank you all. This is my last time on screen, so thank you to our board, thank you to our planning committee, and thank you to our sponsors. This has been a wonderful experience, and we really appreciate you all.